livelihoods. We also think of the humanitarian.
The document arrived on King Charles's desk at 4 in the morning, hand-delivered by the Crown Estate's chief legal officer who'd driven through the night from Edinburgh. Inside was proof that Camilla had attempted something no queen consort had dared in 300 years, legally binding the Crown's most valuable properties to her grandson's future, bypassing William's children entirely. The Edinburgh Discovery. December 4, 2024. Marcus Thornbury had been the Crown Estate's chief property solicitor for 17 years, long enough to know every quirk of the complex legal frameworks governing royal property ownership. But the documents sitting on his desk at the Edinburgh office made his hands shake as he read them for the third time, hoping he'd somehow misunderstood their implications. He hadn't. The annual audit of Crown Estate properties in Scotland was routine, a process that happened every December to verify ownership chains, confirm tax status, and ensure all documentation remained current and legally sound. Thornbury's team had been working through the standard files when a junior solicitor named Alicia Chen had flagged something unusual in the Balmoral Castle documentation. Balmoral, unlike many royal properties, isn't Crown Estate property. It's privately owned by the monarch, purchased by Prince Albert in 1852, and passed down through generations as personal rather than state property. The documentation should have been straightforward. Charles as owner, standard succession provisions that would pass it to William upon Charles's death, no complications or unusual structures. But the documents Alicia had found showed something entirely different. A trust structure created in June of 2023, just weeks after Charles's coronation, that placed Balmoral and its approximately 50,000-acre estate into a complex legal entity called the Highland Heritage Preservation Trust. The stated purpose was conservation and historical preservation, but the succession provisions buried in dense legal language on page 47 of a 63-page document specified that upon Charles's death, control would pass not to William, but to trustees who would manage the property for the benefit of Frederick Parker Bowles, Camilla's grandson, through her son Tom. Thornbury had immediately pulled the original purchase documents for Balmoral, the chain of title showing its passage from Albert to Victoria, to Edward VII through the generations, to Queen Elizabeth and then to Charles. Nowhere in that chain was there any provision for property to pass outside the direct line of succession, and the idea that a private residence owned by the monarch could be placed in trust for someone who wasn't even a royal family member was constitutionally and legally unprecedented. But what made Thornbury's blood run cold was the signature page. The trust documents bore Charles's signature, officially witnessed and notarized. Either Charles had knowingly agreed to divert property away from William and toward Camilla's grandson, or he'd been deceived into signing something he didn't understand. And given the timing, just weeks after the emotional high of the coronation, when Charles would have been signing hundreds of documents related to his new role, Thornbury suspected the latter. He'd spent the next 3 days quietly investigating, pulling property records for other private royal residences, examining trust structures associated with the royal household, looking for similar patterns. What he found was worse than he'd feared. The Highland Heritage Preservation Trust was just one element of a broader scheme. Similar structures had been created for properties including Highgrove House, Clarence House, and even jewelry collections that technically belonged to the monarch personally rather than to the crown. Each trust had been created between May and September of 2023. Each placed valuable royal assets under management structures that would ultimately benefit Parker Bowles family members, and each had been done with just enough legal sophistication to appear legitimate while hiding the true intent beneath layers of corporate structure and trust law complexity. Thornbury had contacted Dame Margaret Blackwell, the constitutional law expert who'd advised the Crown through previous crises, and had driven through the night to deliver his findings personally to King Charles. This wasn't something that could be discussed over phone or email. This was a crisis that could tear the monarchy apart if not handled with absolute discretion and urgency. At 4:30 in the morning, sitting across from a king who'd been woken from sleep to read documents that proved his wife had been systematically stealing his children's inheritance. Marcus Thornbury watched Charles's face transform from confusion to disbelief, to a fury unlike anything Thornbury had ever witnessed from the carefully controlled monarch. The grandson at the center. To understand why Camilla would risk everything for this scheme, you need to understand Frederick Parker Bowles and what he represents to her. Freddie, as he's known to family, is Tom Parker Bowles's younger son, born in January of 2016. He's 8 years old now, a charming boy who appears occasionally in family photos, but who's been kept carefully out of the royal spotlight. Most of the public barely knows he exists, but to Camilla, Freddie is everything. The obsession started shortly after Freddie's birth, when Camilla began making comments to close friends about how unfair it was that her grandchildren would never have titles or royal status, while William's children would inherit everything simply by accident of birth. Those comments had been dismissed as the natural grumbling of a grandmother who wished her family had more official recognition. But they were actually the beginning of something far more calculated. What almost no one outside the immediate family knew was that Freddie's birth had been complicated by a paternity question. Tom Parker Bowles had been briefly separated from his wife Sarah during the period of Freddie's conception, and there had been quiet speculation within the Parker Bowles family about whether Tom was actually Freddie's biological father. A DNA test, conducted secretly and known only to a handful of people, had confirmed that Tom was indeed Freddie's father. But the experience had triggered something in Camilla. She'd become fixated on the idea that Freddie's legitimacy, his place in the Parker Bowles family line, needed to be secured through more than just DNA. She wanted legal protections, financial guarantees, assets that would ensure Freddie's future was as secure as George's or Charlotte's or Louis's. And once Camilla became queen consort, once she had access to Charles and to the machinery of royal property management, she saw an opportunity. Camilla had convinced herself that she wasn't stealing from William's children. In her mind, the royal family had so much wealth, so much property, that diverting some of it to secure Freddie's future was hardly theft. Balmoral was just one property among dozens. Charles owned it personally, not as crown property, so he could do whatever he wanted with it. And if Charles wanted to ensure that his stepson's child was provided for, that was his decision to make as owner. But that logic ignored crucial realities. Balmoral wasn't just a property, it was a symbol, a piece of royal history where Queen Elizabeth had died, where generations of monarchs had spent summers and created memories that defined the family's identity. For Charles to give it to Camilla's grandson instead of his own son and grandchildren wasn't generosity. It was betrayal of the most profound kind. What made Camilla's obsession with Freddie even more disturbing was how she'd justified it to herself. Close friends later revealed that Camilla had developed an elaborate internal narrative where Freddie was somehow owed this inheritance because of what Camilla had endured to become queen consort. She'd suffered years of public hatred, had been blamed for Diana's misery, had waited decades to marry Charles. In Camilla's mind, that suffering had earned her the right to secure advantages for her family, to use her position to balance the scales that birth had tipped so heavily in William's children's favor. The DNA test results, rather than resolving questions about Freddie's paternity, had somehow made Camilla's obsession worse. Now that Freddie's place in the Parker Bowles line was confirmed, she was determined to give him the kind of generational wealth that would elevate the entire Parker Bowles family to something approaching royal status. She wanted Freddie to inherit estates, to have properties that carried historical significance, to be able to claim a connection to the crown that went beyond his grandmother's marriage. And so Camilla had begun the scheme that Marcus Thornbury had uncovered. Systematically, carefully, she'd been transferring Charles's private properties into trust structures that would benefit Freddie and other Parker Bowles grandchildren. She'd exploited Charles's trust, his tendency to sign documents without thorough review, and his desire to make her happy after years of fighting to be together. And she'd nearly succeeded in pulling off the greatest theft in modern royal history. The Balmoral play. The Balmoral scheme had been audacious in its scope and meticulous in its planning. Camilla had started in March of 2023. just weeks after the coronation's emotional high had faded and routine royal business had resumed. She'd approached Charles with what seemed like a reasonable suggestion: create a preservation trust for Balmoral that would ensure the estate's historical character was protected for future generations. Charles, who genuinely cared about conservation and historical preservation, had been receptive to the idea. Camilla had presented it as following his mother's example of careful stewardship, ensuring that Balmoral would never be sold or dramatically altered, regardless of who eventually inherited it. She'd brought in lawyers who specialized in heritage property law, experts who'd discuss the benefits of trust structures in protecting historic estates from taxation and forced sales. The lawyers Camilla had selected were legitimate professionals, but they'd been carefully chosen for their willingness to structure the trust according to Camilla's specifications rather than challenging those specifications on ethical grounds. The documents they'd prepared were dense, complex, filled with the kind of legal terminology that made Charles's eyes glaze over. And critically, the documents had been presented as part of a broader estate planning initiative that included multiple properties and financial arrangements, making it difficult for Charles to focus on any single element. Charles had signed the Balmoral Trust documents on June 14, 2023, in his private office at Clarence House. According to witnesses who'd been present, he'd spent approximately 15 minutes reviewing the papers before signing, asking a few clarifying questions but ultimately trusting that the lawyers and Camilla had structured everything appropriately. He'd been told the trust was revocable, that he could change its terms at any time, and that the primary goal was simply ensuring proper conservation funding and management. What Charles hadn't understood, what the lawyers had deliberately obscured in the complexity of the documentation, was that the trust included provisions making it irrevocable upon certain conditions. Specifically, if Charles died before revoking it, the trust would lock into place, transferring control to trustees who'd been hand-selected by Camilla and who would manage Balmoral for Freddie's eventual benefit once the boy reached age 25. The scheme had nearly worked. For over a year, the trust had existed without anyone outside Camilla's circle knowing its true purpose. Balmoral had continued operating normally, with Charles making decisions about its management and use just as he always had. But behind the scenes, the legal infrastructure was in place to transfer control away from William the moment Charles died. The alarm had been raised by Margaret MacDonald, the head housekeeper at Balmoral who'd worked there for 37 years. Margaret had been reviewing insurance documents in November of 2024 when she'd noticed that the property's ownership was listed under the Highland Heritage Preservation Trust rather than directly under King Charles. She'd questioned this with the estate's business manager, who'd been equally surprised and had begun investigating. The business manager had contacted the Crown Estate's legal office, explaining the discrepancy and asking for clarification. That inquiry had landed on Alicia Chen's desk, triggering the investigation that ultimately uncovered the full scope of Camilla's scheme. And Margaret MacDonald, a 62-year-old housekeeper who'd loved Queen Elizabeth and who understood Balmoral's significance to the royal family, had inadvertently prevented the greatest theft in the monarchy's modern history. When confronted with the evidence, the lawyers who'd structured the trust had initially maintained they'd done nothing improper, that all documents had been signed voluntarily by King Charles with full legal capacity. But under pressure from Dame Margaret Blackwell and threats of professional consequences, one lawyer had broken ranks and revealed the truth. They'd been specifically instructed by Camilla to structure the trust in ways that would be difficult for William to challenge after Charles's death, and to present the documents to Charles in circumstances where he'd be unlikely to read them carefully. William's fury. Prince William learned about the Balmoral scheme on December 5th, when his private secretary received an urgent call from King Charles's office requesting William's immediate presence at Buckingham Palace. William had been at Windsor with Catherine and the children, enjoying a rare quiet evening at home. The call's urgency and the refusal to explain details over the phone had sent immediate alarm through William's household. He'd arrived at Buckingham Palace at 9:30 that evening to find his father in a state unlike anything William had witnessed since the aftermath of Diana's death. Charles was simultaneously grief-stricken and furious, struggling to process that the woman he'd loved for decades had betrayed him in such a calculated and devastating way. And as Charles explained what Marcus Thornbury had discovered, William's own fury had built to levels that made speech difficult. This wasn't about money. The royal family had substantial wealth, and William would eventually inherit enough to ensure his children's futures regardless of what happened to Balmoral or other properties. This was about something far more primal. Camilla had attempted to steal birthright properties from William's children and give them to her own grandchildren. She'd exploited Charles's trust and love to divert assets that had been in the direct royal line for generations. And she'd done it all while smiling at family gatherings and playing the role of devoted stepmother. William's first question was whether Catherine knew. Charles confirmed that he'd already spoken with Catherine, had needed to explain why William was being summoned so urgently. William immediately called his wife, putting her on speaker so she could participate in the discussion. Catherine's voice, when she spoke, carried a steel that Charles had rarely heard from his usually diplomatic daughter-in-law. She tried to steal from my children, from George, who will someday be king, from Charlotte and Louis, who've done nothing but accept her with grace, despite everything she represents. And she did it by exploiting you, by taking advantage of your love and your desire to make her happy. This isn't just betrayal, Charles. This is something I don't have words for. And if you don't act decisively, if you protect her over our children, you'll be choosing her over your own heir and over the grandchildren who actually carry your blood. The words had landed like physical blows. Charles had begun to defend himself, to explain that he'd been deceived, that he'd never knowingly agreed to anything that would harm William or his children. But William had cut him off with a bluntness that surprised even himself. I don't care about your intentions. I care about what almost happened. If that housekeeper hadn't noticed the insurance documents, if the Crown Estate hadn't done their audit, Camilla would have succeeded. Balmoral would have been lost to our family, and you would have been the king who let his wife steal from his own grandchildren because you were too besotted to pay attention to what you were signing. The meeting had gone on for over 3 hours, with William demanding to see all the documentation, insisting on understanding the full scope of what Camilla had attempted. When Charles revealed that similar trusts had been created for other properties, that Balmoral was just the most significant element of a broader scheme, William's fury had evolved into something colder and more dangerous: determination. She has to go, not just from public life, not just from official duties. She has to be removed completely from any position where she could ever again access royal property or finances. I don't care if you stay married to her privately, though God knows why you would. But publicly, officially, she cannot remain queen consort. The title, the position, everything associated with it, has to be stripped. Because if it's not, if you protect her after this, I'll have to consider whether I can continue supporting a reign that values your personal happiness over the monarchy's integrity and my children's birthright. It was as close to an ultimatum as William had ever delivered to his father, and the unspoken threat was clear. If Charles didn't act decisively against Camilla, William would create a public crisis that could fracture the monarchy in ways that might never be repaired. The heir to the throne would effectively be in rebellion against the king, not for political reasons, but because the king had failed to protect the line of succession from his wife's greed. Catherine had added her own devastating contribution. I've spent over a decade being gracious about her, accepting her presence at family events, allowing my children to have a relationship with her. I've never publicly mentioned what she did to William's mother, never complained about the awkwardness of having her in our lives, but there are limits. And stealing from my children, trying to divert their inheritance to her grandchildren, that's beyond any limit. If she remains queen consort after this, you're telling George and Charlotte and Louis that their birthright means nothing compared to your wife's desires, and I won't accept that. None of us will. The legal trap. Dame Margaret Blackwell had spent 72 hours analyzing the documents Marcus Thornbury had uncovered, and her legal opinion, delivered to King Charles on December 7th, was devastating in its clarity. Camilla's lawyers had built a trap that would be extraordinarily difficult to escape without public scandal and potentially years of litigation. The Balmoral Trust, while based on deception, was technically legal. Charles had signed the documents voluntarily, with proper witnesses and notarization. The fact that he hadn't fully understood what he was signing didn't invalidate his signature unless he could prove diminished mental capacity at the time, which was obviously not the case and which would raise questions about his fitness to be king. The trust's irrevocability provisions were equally problematic. While Charles could currently revoke the trust because he was still alive and the trigger conditions hadn't occurred, the documents included clauses suggesting that revocation might be challenged by the trustees as a breach of fiduciary duty to the trust's beneficiaries. Any such challenge would require litigation that would inevitably become public, exposing the entire scheme and humiliating both Charles and the monarchy. Moreover, the timing of when Charles had learned about the trust's true nature was now crucial. The documents had been signed in June of 2023, but Charles hadn't discovered their real implications until December of 2024. That 18-month gap would be used by Camilla's lawyers to argue that if Charles had truly been deceived, he would have noticed and objected much sooner. The delay in objection would be presented as evidence that Charles had understood and accepted the arrangement, only changing his mind when family pressure was applied. Dame Margaret's analysis revealed an even more insidious element. If Charles died before the trust issues were fully resolved, William would face a nightmarish legal situation. As the new king, he'd inherit Charles's personal wealth and properties, but Balmoral would already be locked in the trust structure. William could challenge the trust in court, arguing it was created through fraud or undue influence, but such challenges rarely succeeded and would require proving either that Charles had been mentally incompetent when he signed, or that Camilla had used illegal coercion. Neither standard would be easy to meet. Charles had clearly been competent when he signed, just insufficiently careful in reviewing what he was signing. And while Camilla had been deceptive, she'd used subterfuge and manipulation rather than threats or force. Courts were historically reluctant to overturn properly executed legal documents based on claims that the signer should have been more careful or should have asked more questions. The technicality that could strip William's children of their birthright properties was this: if the trusts were allowed to stand, and if similar structures had been created for other private royal properties, an entire category of assets that should have passed from monarch to heir would instead pass to Parker Bowles' family members. Future generations would lose estates that had been in the family for centuries, all because Charles had been too trusting of his wife and too careless in reviewing documents she'd presented to him. Dame Margaret's recommendation was stark and unambiguous. Your Majesty, this situation requires immediate and decisive action on multiple fronts. First, you must formally revoke all trusts created during the period in question, accepting whatever legal challenges that provocation triggers, but establishing beyond doubt that you do not consent to these arrangements. Second, you must remove the Queen Consort from any role in managing your personal or official finances, eliminating her ability to create future similar structures. Third, and most difficult, you must consider whether someone who has demonstrated such willingness to deceive you for personal gain can continue to hold a position of trust and responsibility as Queen Consort. The brief concluded with words that Charles would never forget. The monarchy has survived many crises, but it survives because monarchs ultimately put the institution before personal relationships. Your mother understood this, your grandfather understood this, and you must understand this now. Protecting Camilla will destroy your reign and potentially the monarchy itself, but acting decisively to correct her wrongs, however painful personally, will demonstrate the kind of leadership the crown requires. Charles's impossible choice. King Charles spent the night of December 7th alone in his private study at Clarence House, the study where he'd signed the Balmoral trust documents 18 months earlier, without understanding what he was actually authorizing. Around him were photographs: his mother, his sons, his grandchildren. Notably absent were photographs of Camilla. He'd removed them hours earlier, unable to look at her face while processing the magnitude of her betrayal. The choice facing Charles was impossible in the truest sense. There was no option that wouldn't cause devastating pain. If he protected Camilla, allowed her to remain queen consort despite what she'd done, he'd permanently fracture his relationship with William and Catherine, would effectively tell his grandchildren that their inheritance mattered less than his wife's desires, and would demonstrate a weakness that would haunt the remainder of his reign. But if he stripped Camilla of her title and position, if he publicly acknowledged that his wife had betrayed him and attempted to steal from his grandchildren, he'd be humiliating the woman he loved, ending the marriage he'd fought so hard for, and admitting to the nation that his judgment about the most important relationship in his life had been catastrophically flawed. There was no middle ground. Dame Margaret had been clear about that. Partial measures wouldn't work. Either Camilla retained her position and the crisis festered until it exploded publicly, or she was removed completely and immediately, sending an unmistakable message that even the king's wife was accountable for her actions. William had given his father until December 10th to make a decision. After that date, William had indicated he would be forced to take his own actions to protect his children's inheritance, actions that would likely include public statements that would make the rift between king and heir impossible to hide or repair. At 2 in the morning, Charles summoned his private secretary and dictated a series of instructions. All trusts created between May and September of 2023 involving royal properties were to be immediately revoked. A forensic audit of all financial transactions involving the Queen Consort's office was to begin immediately. And most significantly, Camilla Parker Bowles was to be informed that she would be stripped of the title Queen Consort and all official royal roles, effective immediately. The official announcement would cite irreconcilable differences in understanding the constitutional role of Queen Consort and the king's determination to protect assets held in trust for future generations. The real reasons would remain classified, known only to the handful of people directly involved. But the action itself would be unmistakable. Charles had chosen his heir and his duty over his wife. Charles met with Camilla the following morning at Clarence House. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. According to one witness who overheard portions, Charles's voice never rose above conversational level, but the fury beneath his words was palpable. Camilla attempted to defend herself, to claim she'd been trying to help, to argue that securing Freddie's future wasn't theft from William's children because there was enough wealth for everyone. Charles had responded with devastating precision. "You exploited my trust. You deceived me into signing documents that would have stolen from my grandchildren. You put your family's desires above my son's birthright, and you did it all while pretending to support me in the crown. I loved you enough to fight for decades to marry you. You've repaid that love by trying to destroy my legacy and harm my family. The title is gone, the position is gone, and we're done." Camilla left Clarence House that afternoon. She would eventually be provided a private residence and financial support sufficient for a comfortable life, but she would never again appear at a royal event, never again hold any official position, and never again have access to the king or royal decision-making. For all practical purposes, she'd been erased from the monarchy, exiled not from Britain, but from relevance. The announcement went out that evening. His Majesty the King has determined that it is in the best interests of the monarchy and the nation that the role of Queen Consort be dissolved. Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles will retain her position as the King's wife, but will hold no official title or duties. This decision reflects His Majesty's commitment to protecting royal assets and traditions for future generations and ensuring the line of succession remains secure. The carefully worded statement revealed nothing about the Balmoral scheme or the broader pattern of attempted theft, but those who understood royal language recognized it for what it was, a declaration that Camilla had committed offenses so serious that complete removal was the only acceptable response. William released his own statement minutes later. "I support my father's difficult decision completely. The monarchy's strength lies in its integrity and its commitment to protecting what has been entrusted to it for future generations. Today's action demonstrates that no one, regardless of their position or relationship to the sovereign, is above accountability." And with those words, the crisis that had threatened to tear the monarchy apart began its resolution. Not cleanly, not without lasting scars, but with the decisive action that preserved the institution, even as it destroyed a marriage and humiliated a queen consort. The document that arrived at 4 a.m. destroyed a marriage, ended a queen consort's reign, and exposed a scheme that would have stolen birthright properties from future monarchs. King Charles faced the impossible choice between love and duty. He chose duty. Camilla Parker Bowles walked out of Clarence House with nothing but her private disgrace and the knowledge that greed had cost her everything she'd spent a lifetime fighting to achieve.